and whether or not the kind of teaching that we provide through our EDD program, at least, can make a difference in practice. There's no doubt that education in the United States, as we heard this morning at the beginning of Dr. Pring's talk, is in crisis. I don't know that we think it's terminally ill, but maybe it is. But on every hand, you hear this notion that education is in crisis. In 1999, Henry Giroux wrote that education was definitely in crisis, but a particular kind of crisis. He said it was a crisis of democracy and ethics, not a general crisis. And yet the dominant response to hearing that education is in crisis is, of course, more accountability, high-stakes testing, teacher testing, performance management, league tables, performativity, all the kinds of things, again, that we heard about this morning. It seems to me, and we had this discussion at our small group just before lunch, that because, at least in the way we think about it in the United States and most of North America, many of our doctoral students are already in leadership positions as headmasters, head teachers, we would call them principals of our schools, seeking to become superintendents, curriculum directors, policymakers, that they really are not only the leaders of the future, but currently the leaders in our educational system. And so it's really incumbent on us to prepare them well to address these dominant discourses and the responses that we find throughout our societies. I think in part, aside from all the high-stakes testing and the league tables and the accountability, there are some other issues that we have failed to address. One is this notion that there's a lot of process conversation. We talk about having dialogue, we talk about distributing leadership and sharing leadership, and we fail to talk, again, as Professor Pring talked about this morning, about what the goals and purposes of education are. In the first class I had with my master's cohort in August, I said to them, what are the purposes of education? And they looked at me as if I had 3 heads. And we talked a little bit, and they said, well, it's to prepare students to pass the tests. And that's really all they had thought about. And I said, but you just started school last week. It started for the year. Didn't you have in your opening workshops and professional development seminars and your staff meetings, didn't you have conversations about the purposes of education? And they said no. And then some of them said, and we've never had those conversations, not even in our teacher education programs. That's unconscionable. On the part of those of us who educate teachers and leaders, it's unconscionable, if that's really true. And so it seems to me that there's lack of conversation about goals. There's a lack of meaningful, deep reflection and conversation in many of our programs, including those that we use to educate educators. There's a tendency to be fairly relativistic. We're trying to be culturally sensitive. And so we don't like to take a stand, particularly on moral issues. And it seems to me that this lack of focus on values and on beliefs is part of the problem. And so when I teach, regardless of what level it is, whether it's master's level or doctoral level, whether I'm teaching about democracy or leadership or research methods, I'm unashamedly teaching about democracy. And I ask my students, what is democracy? And they tell me, it's one person, one vote. It's a process of governance, and I'm sure that that's what you get if you have asked people who hadn't really thought deeply about democracy. And then we talk about whether that means that the majority can always outrule the rights of the minority, or whether sometimes, in an attempt to be culturally sensitive, the minority can hold captive the majority in some ways. And so Judith Green's notion of deep democracy, in which she says a deeper conception of democracy expresses the experience-based possibility of more equal, respectful, and mutually beneficial ways of community life, is the notion of democracy that I try and teach. Notice it's mutually beneficial ways of community life. She's not talking about economic benefit, but a communal benefit in this notion of deep democracy. I also try and teach my students about something that increasingly is known as transformative, as opposed to transformational and other kinds of leadership. Transformative leadership, again, focuses on content as well as processes. It starts with a recognition of the material disparities in the wider society that impinge on the ability of an organization to work successfully with all students and on the ability of all students to necessarily be successful within the organization unless we make changes. And so transformative leadership is something that I think connects to this notion of deep democracy, of social justice, and a social justice education. So those are the kinds of things that I believe that I unashamedly teach about in all of my classes. And yet, I'm very familiar with a lot of writing that says, as Bode said in 2001, the idea of democracy can't be disposed of by dealing with it in a separate course and at some fixed time in the curriculum. So I share that quotation with my students and we kind of laugh about it, and I say, nevertheless, I'm going to teach you a course about democracy anyway. And that's our starting point. I'm sure that you've all had the same experiences that I've had. And increasingly, I'm amazed at how responsive my students are to the kinds of things I've just been talking about. They're hungry for ideas about democracy and equality and social justice. And many of them say that they've never heard the term social justice until they've come into our doctoral program. And I find that amazing as well. And so last summer, as we're finishing, and of course the American program is much more course-based than British doctoral studies are. And so we often, in our EDD programs at least, run cohorts of students. And so they build a sense of a collective community, a support group for one another. And our first doctoral cohort that I've been associated with in the Chicago area has 13 school principals, school-based leaders in it. And they were just finishing their coursework, so they run through about 12 different courses of 48 hours in class each with the group of 13 and a faculty member. And we were just starting a new cohort. And the first cohort said, oh, can we talk to the new students the first day and tell them all the things that we wish we'd known 3 years ago? And I said, sure. And they came into my class. And I stayed for part of the time and then I left because the first cohort said, it's not that we're going to say anything that we wouldn't say to your face, but the new cohort don't know you well enough to know that we can say those things, that we have the freedom to be honest. So they asked me to leave. But they said things that were amazing, like, I came into this program thinking I'd get a higher ed credential, and it has changed my practice. I'm a much better school leader now because of being in this program. It's changed the way I think and act as a school leader, which is really amazing. And then 2 quotes from last summer. One is the EDD cohort. I was teaching organizational theory. You know, Taylor and Fayol and Weber and Mary Parker Follett and all of those old classical names from the turn of the last century. But I try and teach them in a way that helps students understand how and why schools are the way they are, and why, as the population has changed, we need to think about changing schools. So there's always this social justice undertone, regardless of what I'm teaching. After one class, a student came back and said, I've already shared something with my staff members. This was a school principal, a headmaster. This fall, the new group that had never talked about the purposes of education. One student is in a very innovative cohort in his school, and he came back after the first class and said, I've now realized that if I use social justice criteria, this program that I thought was innovative and wonderful is lacking in some ways. And increasingly, I'm getting those kinds of responses almost immediately from my students. And so the question became, how do we know that it works, and what is happening that makes a difference to students? And are they just saying this, or is it really making a difference? So what I wanted to do was a study in which I actually looked at that question. Can graduate coursework make a difference? If so, what is there about it that makes a difference? And then what are the implications for us? So what I've done here is just highlight some of the courses I teach. The